Can you hear me now?
Hear you. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can actually.
Okay, so let me
Perfect.
see. Let me see how I can turn this stupid telegram off. Quick. It always wants to ding, even if I turn it off. It's like ding, ding, ding all the
Yeah,
time.
how are you?
I'm good. I'm sorry. I'm delayed.
No,
Was
no worries.
like up late, and then I was like trying to rush around and look up stuff. There's like so much in Scotland. I
Yeah,
got to.
I know. No, no worries. I'm in no rush today, so it's all right. But yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for doing this. And I'm very excited to ask you a lot of questions, actually. I'm sure I won't be able to ask all of them, but anyway, I thought we just start. Of course, I'm sure you're tired of repeating, your background and all of it. But of course, I think it's good for everyone to know like where you started, who you are, first of all, and what do you do and how you got into the space.
Yeah, so I'm based in Philadelphia in the United States, and sort of describe myself as a mom and an independent researcher. And I actually also I work half time at a public garden, so that's sort of my balance place. And my training academically is in actually art history and historic preservation and
Okay.
historic landscapes. So I have this interesting sort of toolkit, and I came into this unlike a lot of different people have maybe more traditional access points, but mine was really in 2013. They closed a lot of schools in Philadelphia. It was the Boston Consulting Group with our superintendents who had been brought in to sort of privatize and dismantle the public school system. At the time, like I was still very invested in the idea of at least trying to preserve public schools as a civic like place of connection. And so I started to try to figure out why this was happening, and that it was happening for very specific reasons relating to power and money. And then as I worked into that, it was at the same time that as our school budgets were diminishing, the amount of money for educational technology was increasing, and
Mm.
the data analytics on children were increasing. And so I had concerns about data surveillance and profiling and intellectual property, and what artificial intelligence education meant for children and these feedback loops, which now it seems so naive. At the time, it seemed really radical to even imagine that there would be some chatbot AI teaching your third grader. But in 2016, that seemed really radical. And so I got into looking at that and opting out of testing. And then I only could take it so far because for the most part, the people in the education space are really overwhelmed. And we're a city of deep poverty. So it turned out the same playbook was being used across pretty much every element of the social sector. So I was organizing with people with Sherry Honkala, who's a housing rights activist in the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign, which is grassroots, but like not NGO funded, not foundation funded, and led by the poor, really. And so I did that for a while, yeah. So this past year has sort of opened it up to the whole scope being really about a much larger biosecurity apparatus, right? Like controlling not simply your cognitive process or your educational framework, but it actually down to containing your physical body, and your
Yeah,
mobility.
it's incredible how fast, as you said, in 2016, even it seemed radical, all of this, and just how quickly it became, well, not for everyone, of course, because only a few people after all are talking about these things, but how normal it has become, especially after this past year and this pandemic. And I was curious, when did you realize this whole COVID thing was, I mean, I'm not, I really don't want to get into the origins and all of that stuff, but when did you
I mean,
realize?
I knew it was the trigger event like that week.
Yeah.
It's actually ironic because my first piece that I wrote about the pandemic specifically, I was invited by a group that was a nonprofit, like a maternal feminism group, that had a connection to the United Nations, but were increasingly skeptical about what the larger agenda was. And so that there was going to be this conference on the status of women in New York. And so they said, Alison, would you come speak to our group? Because it's also international. This is a group that had an international reach. And so I said, sure, because this is a global situation. This is pre-pandemic, but this is
Mhm.
like, they asked me over the winter and I was preparing my things. And then they would have these huddled meetings where they would be like, what, is it going to happen? They'd rented a hotel room and a conference space and all this stuff next to the UN. I got a badge and I can just take a bus to New York because I'm in Philly.
Mhm.
But they were out west, and it was such a kerfluffle. I'm like, don't worry, I'll just take the bus up. I'll talk to whoever comes. It'll be fine. And I had no clue at that point, like how big it was.
Yeah.
And they said, nope, we're going to cancel, but can you just write up what you would have told us about? This was about the Sustainable Development Goals and the impact on women and children. So I'm like, sure. So I laid it all out, and then the whole thing was canceled. And then the next week, they called the pandemic, the global pandemic. And I'm like, of course, all the people at the UN knew what was they were not going to have a conference on the status of women. They knew that. So, as soon as at work, I was hearing people the same languaging, like, I was like, oh, this is it. And it was
The
terrible.
language, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, everyone was using these same words. And I'm like, this is not normal. And then I was just like, nope, I never would have thought global health was the trigger event, but in retrospect, it actually is perfect to have a trigger event, to have an invisible adversary that, unless you have an electron microscope or access to highly sophisticated medical apparatus, you can't actually assert. It's actually quite brilliant. If it wasn't such a draconian,
nefarious,
program,
in retrospect, it's
brilliant.
like, how could it not have been the public health event? Because it really fits every, from the social aspect and distancing and children not seeing faces, like all these things. It's really incredible how, and I'm not one of those that thinks that everything is perfectly planned and it goes step by step, but it's hard not to believe that. After, when you learn certain things, it's hard not to think that everything is literally connected. And I'm sure you're very familiar with that feeling, from the language, you start seeing it pop up in different places, and it's just insane.
Well, and the thing is, what we're living through now is this cloud-based world, right? And so I think a large piece, which I did not have, like, I've learned a lot this past year. Like, I had a really good handle on like the public policy apparatus and the financial underpinnings and a lot of the sensor technology systems. But idea of like energetics and physics and some of the things that I think are going on behind signals intelligence, like behind all of this sort of, I don't know if you want to call it like the egregore, or an electric sort of thought form, waveform that is part of all of this, is something I'm learning more about. But I think it's very interesting, because then when you say, how does it all click? Individually, all of these people may just stay in their lane and know their bit of information, but there's like an energetic presence that is like flipping all the switches as you go along. And then what does that take? And then how does one disrupt, that waveform?
Yeah.
And that's what I think. And I think that there are powerful opportunities to do that in ways that, if you are limited to a material realm, feel impossible, right? People who are strictly materialist, both on the resistance end and on the end of that's within the more popular culture understanding of things, they're working in a very material sense. And I think that there's something bigger energetically going on that is connected to a deeper spirituality or sacredness, not necessarily organized religion, because they're all in it too. I think there's an energetic thing that's happening that I'm very interested to have had a chance to learn more about.
Yeah, I'm not very well versed in this, but it definitely does feel like we're engaging in a spiritual war, really, almost like for the soul of humanity. I know it might sound ridiculous, especially for people that are not very familiar with these topics, but once you start learning the implications of some of these technologies and what they can do, and blockchain and how they can transform society and individuals, you start to believe in, like, this might be the battle of humanity or something like that.
I call it engagement, because I'm trying not to feed into there's
the war.
Energetic engagement. Yeah. Well, and for a lot of people, I don't know if folks there would be familiar with John Trudell, but that's someone whose teachings have really influenced me a lot. He was a leader in the American Indian movement in AIM. And he talks about, he died by, I think, 2015, but like a predator energy that minds the being part of human. And I don't know how it is there, but at least here in the US, things are so partisan.
Yeah.
And people have these very clearly delineated sort of affiliations, identities, tribal sense, that if I'm right and you're wrong. And I think if what we understood was what is unfolding is an artificial intelligence coup of natural life, if we can talk about it as a predator energy, that is opposed from a place of sacred life, that is something actually that's incredibly unifying as a message. And so
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to get. I had a couple tweets out like this week, and I think people are trying to figure it out, that if we're still talking about this one specific medical situation, we're actually not, if we're limiting our conversation, our energies to that, we're never going to get to the part that we can find a way of bringing people back together, because it's whatever conversation you have a year plus in, people continue just simply to reinforce their position. And
Yeah.
there's no way to break out of that. So it's sort of like, how do you pick something that is integrated with this overall pattern, but beyond, that people can come together around?
Yeah.
And for me, like the idea of natural life and children, is something that most people could get behind. Nobody would want to have children turned into robots,
Hopefully, yeah. But you never know these days.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's fascinating just how divided we are, and how that just literally plays into the hands of these powers, because the more we're worried about political issues and things that ultimately they matter, sure, I mean, a lot of political issues definitely matter, but in relation to this bigger picture that we're talking about, everything feels much less important compared to what we could be heading towards as a global, as a world, really. And
The
it's
planetary
so,
computer.
yeah, it's so infuriating how, and yeah, how just politics derails everything. Oh, and if you don't believe in masks, you must be a Republican, and if you don't believe in this, you might be on that side, and it's just detracts from the bigger conversation.
But
And
I have to say, like, even among the people that follow me on Twitter, it's the most diverse group of people.
mm,
I mean, it's, if you just click through it's very interesting. Sometimes, I'll just look and see who liked a post. Complete
yeah,
breadth of
which is
spectrum.
encouraging, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, because I'm speaking my truth. I'm not trying to brand myself in a way that, like, I'm saying certain things to attract, to build a certain brand. I'm saying this is what I feel is the truth, and these are our moral questions that we have to deal with. And then if people are responding, in a way that is, for the most part, very few people troll me about it. Like, they want to actually engage in these complicated discussions, but they need to have space for it. Those spaces have to exist. So how
Yeah.
do we carve out spaces that allow for respectful, like, unpacking of people's, because, honestly, I come at this from more of a left-leaning, perspective. And it's been very challenging for me to realize that in trying to fulfill my obligations of what I think I need to do in sharing the knowledge that has been passed to me with the larger population around vulnerable populations in particular, given my positionality in Philadelphia, that the people who kind of showed me the ropes on this have disappeared, right? And in some respects actually turned their backs and said, I don't want to have anything to do with you ever
Mm,
again, in very extreme ways. Which I'm like, but I feel like I'm the one, and not to say like a constructive critique, like, Alison, you should be doing this, that, or the other thing to be more effective from this work. No, just a complete
just, yeah.
shutdown. And so, so I try to just talk in a reasonable way to the people who are open to listening. And
Yeah.
I don't actually want to be right. And the other thing is, I will
That's
say,
the
like, I
thing,
don't
yeah.
think it's necessarily going to end the way they think it's going to end. But those of us who are on this path, who can see that the direction, I think we have a responsibility to, in a kind of way as possible, share information so that people have a more informed point of view. Otherwise, they will be making choices without all the information
Yeah.
that will play into the hands of those in power.
Yeah. And that's an interesting thing you mentioned, because I feel like so much of what's happening has, whether you look at the World Economic Forum or the UN Sustainable Development Goals, it feels like they have in many ways co-opted a lot of the language. I don't want to say of the left, but this very sort of, inclusivity, sustainable, all these things, and how I think it's making a lot of people not really look beyond the words, because they just hear these labels, these nice sounding concepts, and lifelong learning, sorry, and all
Right.
these things that sound great, and they're not examined, I think, largely because they sound great, and they're like, oh, great, why not, why shouldn't we do this or that? And I was just wondering what you think about this use of language that is hiding so many things that we don't understand really the depth of. And I don't know if you want to look maybe at the sustainable development goals. I know that's a huge topic, but just it's what.
Well, see, to me, I mean, part of it, yeah, the use of language, I mean, it's because of the machine learning and the AI, like in the ability to categorize people and like the level of being able to use image, because it's also images and languaging and narrative, to shape people's opinions. They know how powerful that is. And I think unless you've dug into it, unless you have some background in like sort of the deep state propaganda and the depth of connections to the film industry, the journalism industry, like over decades, you know, that those are tools to use to both to mobilize people towards certain ends and to placate people. When I was doing some of this research, I was looking into something called DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and also I think it was also Project Minerva, which is another Department of Defense program, where they, I mean, in the CIA too, I mean, they hire behavioral scientists, right? They have the most money to hire people who understand how human minds work. The psychologists, the anthropologists, the media narratives, and they know how to do that engineering, even down to with these digital technologies at almost a neural level. Like they can literally change your physiology with language and images.
And people still think this is science fiction stuff. This is Star Trek.
No, I mean, I would say like, so look up the DARPA Narrative Networks Project, look up Project Minerva, like it's connected with the Cambridge Analytica. Google, Eric Schmidt, who is the former board chair of Alphabet Google, is with New America, and they're a major funder at Arizona State University, which is led by Michael Crow, who's the founding board chair of InQtel, which is the CIA's venture capital fund, right? So
nice
I'm doing work right now in Arizona, right? So it's like the CIA embedded in Arizona, and they have something called the Center for the Future of War. And it's funded by New America, but really mostly Eric Schmidt and Google. And so they have different focus areas, and some of it is on like autonomous weapons and drone warfare. But one of them is weaponized narrative, right? And it's of course framed as like radicalizing people. How do we study the ways in which language and ideas radicalize people against the US government, right?
And use it to our advantage.
Yeah. Right. I mean, well, and so that is, I mean, they're putting lots of money into that research because they know it matters. And the most powerful thing would be to essentially disable your adversary, your opponent, anyone who might oppose the agenda that is in your interests, like the interests of those in power, without actually having to incite physical engagement, right? Like that is not their goal. Like their goal is to immobilize to the extent possible without having to put in those resources or have that potential blowback, right? So in this asymmetrical warfare, controlling the media, controlling the narrative is paramount.
Yeah.
And they have very sophisticated ways of doing that. And I don't know, for those of us who are able to deconstruct these narratives and look at systems of power and look at the language and deconstruct it to say, oh, well, sustainability, all of the things that I'm going to, we'll probably be talking about, it's related to essentially creating global markets for gambling by hedge funds. Okay. And it's a game. It's the hedge funds game. I call it militarized hedge funds because these hedge funds are sort of also integral with big pharma and defense and debt finance. But they're going to set up this game and they need to want us to play it, right? So they're going to paint it in the language of sustainability. And all of it is aligned to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which cover all of these essentially ways of managing people in poverty or dispossessed people. And then a bit on the environment. So it's managing people and a bit on managing the environment, but it's managing them not in a way that they want to redistribute concentrated wealth back to the poor and allow them to have autonomy and how they might want to use that and understand what sustainability looks like in their community. It's creating a global standard for a betting game based on data analytics and predictive profiling. And so my question is always, when we're talking about equity, when we're talking about sustainability, when we're talking about justice, is this the impact management project? Is this the hedge funds talking about managing it as data on a dashboard, which essentially gives them free rein to surveil entire populations and living ecosystems in order to make their betting game work? Or is it actually about divesting themselves of the power they hold? And for the most part, it isn't the latter. It's not about giving back power. It's about further concentrating power under the guise of disruptive innovation.
So I completely agree. And is this game, because you refer to it as almost like a game that hedge funds are going to play, would it be accurate to call it social impact investing? Something like that? Because you've talked about that quite a bit.
Yeah. And so that's how I came into all of this in the education space. Because they were going to frame education. Education is goal number 4. Healthcare is goal number 3. And so they need to translate a social relationship of education or healthcare into a data analytics system. And they call this social impact. But the impact is an action, right? Like, I remember standing outside because much of the social impact space actually comes out of Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania here in Philadelphia.
Okay.
And they gathered all of these investors for a total impact conference. There were 2 of them. And I didn't know about the first one, but I picketed the second one. And it was on May Day of all things. I couldn't get anyone from the left on May Day to come out and picket the global impact investors. So I stood up there with my little poster board and my sidewalk chalk, and like I stopped people, and I remember having all these suits going in this downtown law firm building, and I said, poor people are not things to be impacted. They're not.
Almost like they're objects. Yes.
I'm like, and they could not understand. I'm like, they're not things. You don't get to impact them against their will. Like, that is not a reciprocal relationship. That is a process.
It's like you're trying to steer something towards something you want, basically. That's their perspective, I would say. Incentivizing certain behaviors and all that. So it's not really the way you should talk about a human being, I think. And it's so encompassing. You meant, when talking about the UN Sustainable Development Goal, is that because it's so hard to understand, like, who is driving this? And it doesn't feel like that there's an answer to that, because these things they're mutually feeding into each other, whether it's the UN Sustainable Development Goals or the World Economic Forum, which I'm pretty sure they partnered up last year to further the same sort of agenda. So do you have a view on, like, who is actually directing this the most? Is this even a question that's fair to ask?
I would invite people to look up the Impact Management Project. The Impact Management Project. It's 2,000 of the world's largest asset holders. Now, the backstory of this, and again, it comes back to Philadelphia, so that's why I feel like I have a responsibility to try to share what I know, is that the former president of the University of Pennsylvania, her name was Judith Rodin, and she left the university and became the head of the Rockefeller Foundation.
Okay. Ooh, great.
And so in the lead up to the last global economic crash, they created something called the Global Impact Investment Network. And now that was probably also in conjunction with Wharton and Comcast, which is a major telecom company here. Like, there were collaborations of all these things, because to document impact, it means you have to have all of this data. You have to have baseline data, and then you have to have outcomes data, right? And so, and everything in between. The more data, the better for their purposes. So they created this in the lead up to the last global economic crash, which we know was essentially created because of concentrated wealth that necessitated putting resources into real estate and housing debt, and creating markets in housing debt that were not sustainable for individual people, and sacrificing those people to the systems that needed to have that debt packaged for the game. And that was that game. That was the housing game. And that was The Big Short. That I direct people to that film, The Big Short. In the 10 plus years since then, the wealth has only become way more concentrated. And so if they need to play the equivalent of that game again, what is the next bigger debt security opportunity? And there really isn't much bigger than housing other than human capital.
Yeah. Because there's no other place to go, basically.
So now they have to essentially reframe people, human beings, as debt commodities through predictive profiling. And this is it's all a fiction, but this is the game that they're trying to set up the rules. that before you're even born, based on your data analytics, we will expect that we will have to put X amount of resources into you to manage you as a productive citizen, right? And you may, for whatever circumstances of birth, the location, your parents, blah, 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 that you are broken, that we will perceive of you as being broken to some degree. And some people will need more resources and some people might not need as much, but everyone comes out of the womb as a burden. And that is a twisted Western scientism based
fully utilitarian almost, like,
but it's for the game. It's for the hedge fund game, the militarized hedge fund game. And these are people who are running this game, including Open Society. And, you know, George Soros and Stanley Druckenmiller, these pilots were in the Harlem Children's Zone. Druckenmiller was the board chair of Harlem Children's Zone. They shorted the British pound together, right? Like, if these are people who would short a national currency, what the heck are they doing with toddlers? Like, I don't think we should trust that these are well-intentioned individuals.
No, George Soros is literally on record on video saying he's amoral and proud. Like, he doesn't care very much about the impact of his investment strategies. He's just, as long as he makes money, he's happy.
They're going to do data analytics on unborn children to play this game with, essentially. Yeah, and that's the game. And that's been aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. So, like, 1 is poverty, 2 is hunger, 3 is health, 4 is education, 5 is gender equity. You know, it goes on and on. The justice system, smart cities, air and water. The things about the environment are about managing people in relation to the environment. And these are poor people, not rich people, right? So rich people can have a ranch, or an island or whatever, and do whatever the heck they want. But poor people have to use paper straws and not eat meat or not do that. Like, it's all about engineering people to a certain end as it's a programmable matter ultimately. And I think, and this might be a bit of a stretch for your audience, I don't know, but like, what I wasn't really grasping until maybe the past 6 months is that all of the data that will be gathered under these social impact deals, under that justification, we will feed you if you perform to our standards. We will house you if you behave if you behave in a sustainable way. You know, we will, give you healthcare. We will train you to be the humans that we need for essentially a post-human world. And this is what we're in. We're in this threshold of this fourth industrial revolution in which automation, artificial intelligence, synthetic biology are all key factors. And they pretty much talk about, there was an Edmund Rothschild Foundation video that I shared earlier this week, a short one.
I watched it, yeah.
Exactly what they're doing. They're like, automation is making human capital obsolete, which means they're going to turn the world over to the robots, and we're just in the way. So we're supposed to train the robots with actually our beingness. We're supposed to train the robots to be human so they can replace us. And in the meantime, these impact deals are both allowing for population level surveillance, potentially bioengineering. And this is all framed as personalized medicine so that they're extracting the data of our beingness and creating digital twins of us in cyberspace. So that is the other piece of the economic paradigm, is not simply the debt finance trading piece, which I was pretty familiar with going in because of my work in the education space, but literally they are creating doubles of us in a virtual realm, which is the new empire. They are coding into existence both an augmented reality layer on the world, which is an open air digital prison, but they are also creating gamified environments like video games, like us living through a simulation of a, MMORPG, online video game. And all of the data that we create in these impact deals is then thrown into our digital twin that lives in that space. And then that in itself becomes a value commodity. So global capital is reaching a threshold in which it needs to have a new paradigm shift, because the resources are too concentrated. People don't have spending power. People have too much debt. And by the way, the earth has a certain limited carrying capacity. So how do we exponentially grow with all of those limitations? And their answer is, we will build a virtual reality realm and you will live there. Some version of you will live there. And actually, if we need more economic growth, maybe we'll split you into alters and we'll have multiples of you live in there and consume digital goods, and we will bet on you in the virtual realm. And it sounds crazy, but if you understand the logic of how these global economic systems work, I don't really, that seems to be what they're doing. And so this digital twinning, this transhumanism, that's both using biosensors and cybernetics to mirror ourselves into this virtual realm. And, and it's one thing for adults to maybe say, well, I don't know, I like a video game as good as the next person. Maybe that's okay by me.
Yeah.
But what we're doing to children and the unborn, and then the apparatus of this virtual realm, is so toxic. The e-waste, like anyone who thinks that the sustainability metrics are green is kidding themselves.
Yeah.
It's EMF radiation, it's toxic, it's rare minerals, it's child labor mining those minerals, it's e-waste. It's, none of this is sustainable.
Yeah.
And if anyone just stopped to pause for a minute, they would realize that a green agenda that lives on a data analytics dashboard isn't of itself abhorrent.
Yeah. So much in there. Yeah. And this first thing I thought about was the way we talked about it right at the start, this parasitic element and how these machines are learning from us, and how I just literally reframe my mind to think of it that way. And add an Oculus, which you're gonna not hate me for this, but my family lives in Zimbabwe, and I went back. Last time I saw them was in December of 2020, and I was just managed to get there and back before they had another lockdown in the UK. Literally the same day I arrived, they locked everything down. But I brought because I wasn't using this Oculus much, so I brought it to my family and I gave it to them. Like, I don't use it that much. It's fun, but I can only play for like half an hour before I get dizzy, and so I gave it to my family and my sister, who's 12, and she uses it, and she likes it, but luckily she's not addicted to it or anything. But it just made me reframe the way you talked about this, how we're feeding these machines with our being, basically. And as they're learning, like all of the other stuff is playing out, and it's very hard to accept in a way what you're saying, because it sounds so dystopian and ridiculous. But in many ways, as you said, once you start looking at all these various patterns and how global capitalism has evolved, there's really not many other ways to look at it, and it's scary, and it's in many ways disarming, because you're like, okay, this thing is so big, what am I supposed to do? But I think that what we're doing,
dandelions, you need to send me some dandelions.
Yeah, exactly. That's something I was going to ask you about, your manifesto. But yeah, it's absolutely incredible. And there's an analogy that you made a few times about how we are the situation we find ourselves in today is comparable to, in colonial times, 500-600 years ago, when the people were seeing the colonial ships arrive, and they didn't really have a language or frameworks to even understand or conceptualize what it could mean for them in the future. So I was wondering if you could expand on that analogy and what it means for us. And if you had to pick like one concept that you think everyone should know today, what would it be? Like a really important thing that we need to understand in order to navigate this coming paradigm shift, if there is one.
Well, I will just give credit to my new friend, Stephen Newcomb. So that was from his he did an interview with a friend, Tessalina, that stuck with me, that teaching, right? Like, until you have, and we talked about language before, until you have, your language represents your worldview, right? Mm-hmm. Your conceptual apparatus. And, he was saying that he's, original people of the Shawnee Lenape here in Turtle Island. And he said, his ancestors had no language to understand what was coming when the ships of the invaders arrived on shore. And he specifically has done a lot of work around the papal bulls and the legal apparatus of this. He calls it the doctrine of domination, of sort of Christian domination of the New World. And so understanding the framework and people, and it's very difficult. I'm still working on a glossary for all of these phrases. And some of it is, again, deconstructing words that we think we know, but we don't know the intent, right? Like the sustainability and the equity words that if we take them at face value based on what we think they mean, it's very different than if you're a data analyst working for Open Society, or a hedge fund manager is very different. So it's conceptually, I would say the thing that I think is most important for now is, I think, this idea of the spatial web.
Okay.
is really a key concept. And the spatial web is essentially layering data and permissions onto the physical world. They call it Web 3.0. So it's like the internet has come out of the screens, out of your laptop or your tablet or your phone or your Apple Watch or whatever, and it actually lays on the land. And so it's all of the smartness, and I was looking, before I started in Edinburgh is like a center for
Yeah.
smartness. And
Yeah.
actually my child several years ago went on, they went and were doing this hiking thing. And I'm pretty sure like they sent me a picture of a bench, like an Internet of Things bench in a city plaza. And they were probably the only kid there in high school who knew what this thing was, like this weather sensing bench or whatever.
And
That
this
was
was
a
a few years ago already.
yeah, this was
Wow.
several years ago. This was
Okay.
probably about 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah. And so they're like, hey, mom, there's this Internet of Things bench here in the middle of the plaza here in Edinburgh. So it might have been Glasgow actually, on their trip. And so I'm like, oh, wow. Okay. So it's definitely on the move. And again, Edinburgh has this futures initiative, data-driven innovation. They were talking about something called city sounds, like this organicity. And again, it's anything but organic, where they were putting, this was in 2017, I read, that audible sensors in the meadow to capture
Mhm.
the sounds of people and ecosystems for art and data as scientists,
For
right? But
art.
really it's surveillance, right?
Yeah.
Or they would put it in the library so that they could better book like study space in the library, that they would have these in and out sensor systems. And it's all about it isn't liberation, it's about scarcity management and data capture. But that is the spatial web, right? When you have these smart environments, when all of a sudden the environment is sensing you in a way that is then fed into these weaponized really systems of data collection. So these could be, again, smart. I went to take care of my elderly parents a few months ago, and I had to get something at the Best Buy like store, and I hadn't been in one of those in like 10 years. And I walked in, and like, yeah, there's a few TV sets in the back and a few other things, and the whole middle was smart home. Everything was smart home
Mhm.
technologies, right? The nests and the sound systems and the light systems. So this sensor network is both in your interior space, but then it extends to if you imagine like mobility sharing, that's what they call it now. I don't know if y'all have those scooters or bike shares or
Yeah.
ride shares. Like they're all going to be QR code activated, and those codes are the part of the sensor network. If you're carrying a smartphone, that's part of the sensor network. And so in the spatial web, in the Web 3.0, your experience both of your internal world and your external world is predicated on contracts that
Mhm.
are invisible, that are invisible digital contracting systems. And that you, as a digital citizen, and this is another big thing in Scotland, like the e-government push for digital identity,
Mhm.
depending on how you are represented in data, you have more or less access to the built environment. Your rights and privileges of how you move within the spatial web can be constrained or loosened at will, depending on your data profile, your digital profile. And so right now what we're seeing is that might relate to, oh, people are allowed to be 5 miles from their house, right? Or 20, or now 1 block, or only 1 mile 3 times a week. Like they can regulate that, how you relate, your freedoms
And
really.
this is
And
geofencing effectively. This
it's
sort of
geofencing, and it
this
came in very
barriers. Yeah.
slickly because it was just like marketing, right? They're like, oh, you walk by in front of a shop and they can send a push notification if you want a discount on your pizza or whatever. Or you're in a museum and you get a push notification that this is the interesting thing about this painting. And it's augmented reality. And I will say that I don't know if it's different setups, but in the US, the big push behind this is Niantic, right? The Pokemon Go phenomenon.
Mhm.
Well, Niantic was funded by In-Q-Tel, the CIA. Like for the most part, people don't say, oh, by the way, augmented reality is funded by the Five Eyes. They're not telling you that. And the entity that's really pushing it is the Knight Foundation here, which is formerly newspapers, the Knight companies. It's tied into cities that had a Knight newspaper company presence, but they've partnered with Niantic to do augmented cities. And it's framed in this playful way that's immersive. Like, don't you want to come and walk in the park and access interesting spoken word poetry, or access an interesting historical fact, or do, and so the initial rollout is something that's very enticing, especially in this socially distanced moment. Oh, look, I can have a whole performance. I can sit here in the park and queue up, and eventually like a hologram, of these things. And it's very gradually normalizing, like, well, who would say listening to a poem on your phone is a bad thing? Like, no, that in and of itself. But if it becomes, once you have the apparatus, this open air digital prison, right? Or the only information you can access is engineered by the AI to put you on a career pathway, put you on a certain mindset, be treated as psychotherapy, right? So you could be a conforming digital citizen. Then none of that is in our control. I'm trying to get ready for a talk I'm giving in Arizona, and I sort of equate it to those build your own adventure books. I don't know if you ever saw those. They're like little cheap paperback books, and geared towards like middle school kids. And they would say, it would be an adventure story, and you would get to a point and they would say, do you want to open the door? Or do you want to like get in the car? And then you pick, and then it'll say, turn to page 70 or turn to page 88. And you turn, and then you make your way through the book. And then, so there are options, but they're all in the book. And what I'm trying to say is, like, the book is written by the militarized hedge funds.
Yeah.
So it may seem like we're having fun in the adventure in the book, but we didn't write that book.
Yeah.
We're living in somebody else's book.
Oh my goodness. So much again to
Google's book.
Someone I had like 3 questions that I forgot because it's really, it grabs you in many ways. But do you have any more like stuff, because my audience is mainly, I would say, in the UK, quite a bit, like around Edinburgh and Glasgow, but not only. But I was curious if you have any other interesting information on Edinburgh being the center of a lot of this, and anything we should I'm not even sure how to ask. Like, what does Edinburgh really play like a big global role in this? Because I remember you sent me something about Cardano, and then I'm also going to ask you about Africa and what's happening with these pilot projects there. But is there anything else you wanted to add on Edinburgh being basically a center of this that might be interesting? Or
it's interesting. So when I was doing mostly still education and poverty research, I came across something called the ACEs. Okay, like trauma-informed nation. So Scotland is being set up as the first trauma-informed.
Yeah, and you sent me that link as well.
Right. Yeah. And so ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So at the same time, what I was looking into was that the Kaiser Permanente health system based in California, which is managed care, which is, again, it sounds great unless you understand it, how you're being managed, right? As like preventative care systems, but a very corporate version. And they had been the NHS in the UK had brought in Kaiser Permanente to come advise them, right? So the socialized medicine was becoming less and less socialized as sort of this California-based technocratic system came in to do this advising. So Kaiser Permanente developed what's called a rubric for ACEs, in which they would screen people for childhood trauma. Okay. And that could be anything from like a parental divorce to physical abuse, emotional abuse, different, a death in the family, different traumatic circumstances, which then have long-ranging health impacts, which I'm not disputing, but it was a very specific rubric set, and it was scoring. And so this is a setup for this social impact finance, right? It's all based on predictive profiling. So they want to know how broken you are so that they can take credit and money and profit from fixing you, right? And in this very perverse way, if they create these global investment markets in managing trauma, there's only an incentive to have more better managed trauma. Like
exactly.
If they create a profitable market in trauma management, no one's ever going to be incentivized, UBS Bank or Goldman Sachs or Lloyd's, to actually stop the trauma. They'll just have more trauma and have it ameliorated or managed in a certain way, right?
Yeah, it's like you were talking about with Catherine Austin Fitz, these poverty management projects. I don't know if it was in Philadelphia, but the incentive becomes not
It's
solving
just
the
the logic.
problem,
It doesn't
but
mean
just,
those
yeah,
people are bad people, but if you're making money, how would you ever stop it?
yeah,
Like
it's, yeah.
you wouldn't. I mean, because that's just not how it works. So when I wrote this piece about ACEs, and then increasingly it's connected to social emotional learning, because if you understand in this perverse way, the fourth industrial revolution is about building a post-human world.
Hmm.
And they're going to do that through economic dispossession, synthetic biology, and digital surveillance and digital twinning. They want to capture the children in particular. And they actually, what they most want is for people who are emotive, including children who haven't learned to like contain their emotions, to train the robots. They want that. They want that immediacy of emotion. So it's terrible to think. And I did not think about this when early on, I thought it was just a market because of brainwashing children for profit. Like, but they've actually said, we can't change, this is Jim Heckman, this early childhood investment equation. We can't change cognitive data, their IQ, because it hardens up, but we can change character. And then there's this huge focus now on social emotional curriculum, and teachers college, Columbia University has this guy, Clive Belfield, has a whole equation about social emotional learning curriculum. So people have been led to believe like, great, they care about my kids' well-being. No, they care about tracking it to feed it to the robots and to underpin these financial markets. So that ACEs trauma scoring, like they would then use cognitive, like there's this guy, Richard Layard, who's in the UK with, I'm not sure if it's the London School of Economics. He has this layered equation for depression that is the cost offset for unemployment, right? Their unemployment has a cost. When people are depressed and they don't go to work, there's an economic cost.
Okay.
And so if we can make them less depressed and get them back to work, the government saves money. It's this layered equation. And essentially they scale the NHS mental health division on the layered equation. Well-beingness, happiness, but it's based on data analytics, and they would do pop-up happiness centers. But all of the data analytics for these impact markets had to be digital. So you would have cognitive behavioral therapy. You couldn't just have talk therapy, or you would have something that would have data attached to it to justify the deals. If you just went to a therapist and talked and no one really did anything and they wrote some handwritten notes and you went back to work, it wouldn't work for the hedge funds because it has to be at scale.
Yeah.
And now they're doing CBT therapy in VR headsets, right? And in gamified environments. And now they're talking about developing synthetic therapists and text-based text therapy. So all of this has to be digitized for these markets. So anyway, it's connected with the trauma. It's connected with the mental health systems being digitized. It's connected to these impact markets. It's connected to California. And then Scotland brings Nadine Burke-Harris, the Surgeon General that Newsom appointed in California, to Scotland to say, y'all are going to be the trauma-informed nation. You're going to be the first one.
And everyone's like, great. Yeah.
We're going to all be about fixing trauma. Only what they're not saying is, by the way, it's an impact market. By the way, we're interested in feeding your kids emotional data to the robots. By the way, we also have this thing, I think it's called GRIFEC, getting it right for every child, which my understanding is there were terrible problems in Scotland with family separation due to poverty, that children and families were being profiled not because of abuse, but because of neglect.
Mm-hmm.
And children were being profiled in schools to offer up under this social emotional learning surveys about their parents and all sorts of things that were leading to family separation. And there was something up until I think 2019 called the named person scheme.
The thing where they want to assign every kid
a child minder, a non-family minder of every child from birth. Now that was pushed back by the Supreme Court, but all of this is connected, because they really do want the children. And
that's what it sounds like. It sounds like they're trying to cut the family out almost.
Yeah.
From the process.
And I make this connection to what happened here in North America around the original people, around indigenous nations, because part of that erasure that had to happen for the colonial project, the manifest destiny of taking over North America, was the erasure of indigenous people, the erasure of the original people. And that was done one through genocidal militarized campaigns and starvation, but also they took their children and sent them to these residential schools where they were traumatized, killed, and then told to erase who they were, right? And so if we understand it from that framing, that is what I think where things are going. And I was really surprised this piece that I wrote kind of went viral for me. Like, this is before anyone was even listening to me. I'm like, how is this a thing in Scotland? But, you know, interestingly, it was many people who I would say identify from a conservative standpoint. But I could see if someone says, we're going to set up AI social welfare analytics, we're going to set up a minder outside your family to track your kid. We are going to not address poverty and actually create more poverty, and then create incentives to separate children from impoverished families. And, you know, there are huge concerns there. So I would say the ACEs is a big piece. And what I hadn't quite understood is both from that, it was backed by the Carnegie Corporation,
Mm-hmm.
and also the changes to the education system, also backed by the Carnegie Corporation, that there are very direct ties to Scotland with Carnegie. Like, he was Scottish,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And I
yeah.
did not, like, that didn't occur to me at the time. So the other piece that's coming online is something called open badges and open education. And it's tied to this stuff called OER, which are open education resources, which are that you will interact with digital media, and there will be metadata that you will earn micro credentials and badges that will essentially feed into your profile as human capital.
Yeah, I
And
saw
their
you had a
plan,
tweet about badges recently.
yeah.
I'm
So
forgetting
the
now.
badges
Yeah.
are huge. There's open badges at the University of Edinburgh, digital credentials, Credly. So this idea of, as they're digitally twinning you, you know, they're gambling on your, essentially, if you understand it as a game, and I'm trying to figure out how to talk about this, as like an open air gaming environment in which you are assigned quests to accomplish tasks based on of self-improvement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you're suffering from addiction. Here are your tasks. Here's your quest to recovery. Oh, you are suffering from hunger. Here's your quest to become gainfully employed. Oh, you're unhoused, you're whatever, like you're traumatized. We will assign you a playlist of things to do about that. And then we will track you in the smart environment, whether you did them or not, because now with all of these sensor networks, wearable technology, ICT technology, with the social workers, with the educators, with the healthcare providers, we can track if you actually did it in this Internet of Bodies environment. So the open badges in education are a quest for self-improvement for the fourth industrial revolution gig economy. Here's your career pathway. Here's what we've decided you shall do. Go earn these 200 micro credentials. And then you won't actually have a place to do it. It will just be like, the city is your classroom. Here it's Pokemon Go. It's just like Niantic and the CIA won it. Go wander around and do some stuff. And actually, maybe, nope, you're not allowed to wander around anymore because it's pandemic. So sit in a closet, put on a VR headset, and pretend you're wandering around places, and then do things and earn badges that go in your blockchain learning locker so we can bet on our game. And
Still
that
wear a
sounds
mask.
crazy,
Wear a
but
mask while you do that, just to be safe.
yeah, that's because that's, well, your avatar can wear a mask. So that's the education thing. And there's something called the UK Center for Games Excellence in Dundee, Abertay University. I don't know that.
If I hear one more of these foundation centers for whatever, oh my God, there's so many.
Well, the crazy thing is, this woman, or I think it's a woman, I'm not 100% sure, Lori O'Neill, this person, Lori O'Neill, they were actually doing curriculum development for a program called Neo World, KNEO, which was social emotional learning behavior management for essentially special needs youth. So like ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, kids on the spectrum. And it was a gamified behavior management curriculum. And this is being developed. Shows you how global it is. The guy who was developing it, who was spearheading it, was a media and big pharma guy, because this is digital therapeutics in New York. He contracted the research in a university in Australia. He has people from Scotland and Indonesia developing the curriculum. And then they piloted it as an app in China. And then Facebook is involved, and it's framed as homeschooling too, right? Homeschooling opportunity. So these digital educational therapeutics are in this cloud-based world. It is a global colonial enterprise, really. in which children are just seen as programmable material.
Yeah, and now it's not there's no national boundaries. It's not about our nation
No.
versus your nation. It's literally the rich and everyone else, basically, who are going to
Exactly. And
be
people
into
are
this
still
game.
not understanding that. Like, I mean, I think a lot of people in the US who are conservative still are not understanding haptic remote labor and telepresence labor. That, like, getting on the phone and calling somebody in a call center, halfway around the world,
Yeah.
that's really old school. Now they're going to be running the robots, remote presence robots. And again, can they scale it all? I'm not sure how long it will take, but this past year has really shown that if they really lock things down and get people in a very vulnerable, fearful state, they can accomplish a lot in a relatively short
So
time.
much fear, really. It's incredible how irrational we become just as people when fear is involved. And of course, then you add on top all the manipulation in the media and everything else, but just fear, seeing on TV a lot of people dying and everything, how that turns off your basically critical thinking, and anything goes.
Well, and people don't have a bigger context. Like for me, I knew exactly what the bigger context was. I'm like, this is the trigger for this much larger agenda. Most people are kept from this. How many people do you hear talking about the spatial web? How many people do you think are talking about artificial, generalized artificial intelligence? Like there aren't, and the existential threat to natural life on the planet, or biosensors, or synthetic biology. Like they're not going to let you know about this, even though if you're working in this field, I was just posting about CRISPR engineered food. There was a gentleman from North Carolina State, and he's talking about, and they're like, well, how do we get everyone to eat CRISPR engineered food, like not just genetically modified food, but food that could conceivably modify your own genetics in a very direct way? And they're like, well, we're just gonna, we're gonna tell them it's sustainable, right? We're gonna tell them that this is sustainable. It's all about the narrative, right? It's all about the narrative. So, just the last thing I will mention about Scotland, and the UK in general, there are like 10 digital nations, and if we understand that this hedge fund game is predicated on reframing our relationship to the state, whatever state authority presence it is, as a digital entity. A digital identity is critical, and Scotland is pursuing like a single sign-in digital identity system. They have a whole program around developing digital identity in Scotland specifically, but the UK was one of the first 3 digital nations advancing that. And again, colonial project. They will frame everything as efficiency, transparency. But once they have you set up as an interoperable data system, everything you do, every interaction you have with the state, whether it's how you spend your education voucher, what your response is to your therapy appointment, what poem you watch in the public park, like all of that becomes part of your digital profile and available for managing you as a data commodity. Yeah. And that's something that is the flip side of this efficiency. It's a very ruthless efficiency that is being framed as also sustainable. And Edinburgh has this 2050 vision around smart city. And the COVID, everything is like, oh, now it's paperless. We don't want to touch paper. We want to be efficient. We want for people to be able to manage all of this from home so they don't have to actually come into our office. And what we've seen, at least, in the US, and I'm sure everywhere else, is all the public meetings now are this way, right? You can't get to the people. You can't have a sidebar conversation. You can't pull someone aside in the hall and say, this is my real concern. They can cut you off if you're giving testimony and they don't like you. They just turn you off, right? Like in a way that you can't when you're physically present. So the direct democracy element of being real physical humans is disappearing. Yeah. But it's being papered over in this way that makes it seem palatable.
And this is honestly what's at stake. Like our ability to freely go out in the street and meet someone for a pint, like go to a pub. Like I think what's at stake is really what we consider completely normal until a year ago, in terms of our relationship and how freely we saw each other, which even then you could make all sorts of arguments that our old normal was screwed up to begin with. And I would understand that. But we really risk, I mean, as we've said earlier, like losing our humanity, I think. And you mentioned the social contract. Is this, because I just made a little connection, because the World Economic Forum and their Great Reset stuff talks a lot about reframing or just changing the social contract? So is this also related to what you just mentioned, just
Well, I
reframing
think,
that
I mean, what
relationship
I'm trying
with
to
the
sort
state?
of say is that the spatial web, like, it's like every way in which you engage with a sensor based, either another person or a physical item, is like a mini contract, right?
Yeah.
And so what I'm trying to get people who are, again, not necessarily of my ideological framework, but here in the US about like, it's about the Constitution. And I'm like, well, the Constitution didn't help the Indians in the reservation system, right? Like there are limitations on this, but like even those who are holding on to these rights that are guaranteed, which again is a good thing. I'm not about like, let's throw it all out and so George Soros can come write our Constitution again, but like understanding it, if you understood that you're never going to get to your constitutional rights anymore, because this layer of public-private partnership, social impact, spatial web is going to be a buffer between you and whatever legal rights you previously had as a citizen of whatever country you're in. You're never going to get to this part, the court part, because the smart contracts aren't going to, it's going to be padded over. So you can't even get down there. And if they understood that, and there's a bunch of people who are focused on like the sovereignty movement, right? This idea of reclaiming your sovereignty and the maritime law and all this stuff and the straw man. And I'm like, well, I'm not as well schooled in all of that, but I'm like, if you really understood the straw man at this point, your digital twin is that, right? If you guys are so smart about all of this legal stuff, I need some lawyery people to start looking at spatial web contracts and blockchain
Yeah.
identity and the straw man and the digital twin and melding that into the analysis. I'm not saying I'm skilled enough to do that work, but to me, it seems a logical extension. The people who are building this stuff out, it's the coders, but it's also the lawyers, the contract lawyers, and it's the accountants.
Yeah.
The KPMGs, Deloitte's, Accentures, they're on the front end of this colonial project.
How much do you think they actually understand the implication of what they're doing? Because the way I see it right now, it's only really the people at the top that get it, and a lot of people really think they're doing it for a good cause, or but I don't know, to be honest. It's hard to say. But what do you think?
I mean, I think it's really, a lot of people don't want to know what they're a part of, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a huge level of denial. I mean, you know, I did not expect to do this. This is not, I'm just I'm not a journalist. I'm not any of these things. And I just kept pulling the string, and then I wandered out of the cave. I mean, and once you're out, you can't,
Really go
once you
back
see
in.
the apparatus, there's no way of looking at any new piece of information, not plugging it into the apparatus. But
Yeah.
most people never want to zoom back to actually see the machine that they're in, because I think, and this goes back to like my dandelion thing, is once you've zoomed out and you see it, it feels overwhelming, and then you feel disempowered, right? So what am I supposed to do about it? How do I live as a moral individual knowing this? Because, and I'm not saying I'm doing it necessarily the right way, I'm sort of muddling through, but I'm like, we have to see it, like we have to confront it and at least say it's not okay. And in that way, I've been doing some of these ceremonial,
why don't you tell us quickly about the Dandelion Manifesto and what you're doing? Yeah, what you've been doing.
Well, so I mean, part of this is really heavy information, and so like I said, I've been gifted. I think I've been put like not on a assigned pathway, but I think I feel like I'm doing something I'm supposed to do. Like we all have our task in this. And so part of my balance is I work in a garden. Usually I have a desk job, but the last year or so I've been outside more supporting our horticultural staff on land, and like being with beings, right? Being with natural beings, this natural energetic system. And it was hard over the winter because I had less of that time. But come spring, it just came to me one day that the dandelion. And so the dandelion is a significant plant being, is that it's humble, right? It's on almost every continent except Antarctica. It has both the sun and the moon and the stars. It has all these life cycles, often on the same plant at the same time. It's a medicinal. And so it is good for a liver cleanse, which is anger, bile, right? And it draws minerals deep from within the earth. It's a food. It's of the regular folk people. Anybody has access to it. In fact, in some ways, the people like in cities and empty lots, the dandelions are far more prevalent than in the suburbs with like these mown yards. So like the poor have access to the dandelions. And then I read somewhere that I feel pretty strongly that the Minotaur in the Greek myth is Wall Street. And so Theseus, before he fought the Minotaur, Hecate fed him for 30 days on dandelion greens.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And so, yeah, so and I did not know any of this, like, but the dandelion came to me. I'm like, let me look into this dandelion thing. And so I said, you know, in the spring, I said, send me. And then I connected with some wonderful people in New York City, because again, in this quest, I don't like to court, I don't like to be in people's faces about things, right? Like I'm not an aggressive. I prefer to say, this is my truth. This is how I see things. If this resonates with you, let us collaborate, rather than to wave fingers and tell people they're doing it wrong. And unfortunately in Philadelphia, most of the people who are organizing are still like, let's go to the Constitution Center and fight for our freedom with a bunch of flags, which isn't me. Like, that's just not my framing. And so the people in New York seemed much more open to this larger message. And then it turns out actually that Manhattan is a center for so much of this, right? The hedge funds, the Federal Reserve, Wall Street, you know, Columbia, the technology, Cornell Technion and Common Pass. Like there are many elements. And I said, well, let's just bring these, let's put out a call for dandelions and we'll take them to New York and we'll ceremonially say, we don't accept this. Because in some ways, from an energetic standpoint, they rely on us giving our tacit permission. And by saying nothing, we're giving our permission. Like we're agreeing that because
accept
we haven't
the terms and conditions. Just click.
Right.
Yeah.
So Easter Sunday, we actually 25 of us met on Park Avenue outside the Council on Foreign Relations. And we had this ceremony. We ripped up the Foreign Affairs magazine about social impact investing. And we said, nope. And then we put our good intentions. I made a quilted like pillow form with a heart on it. And we put dandelion leaves in it. And then we left it outside and we said, you don't have it's not in our name. Like we understand this is an extension of slavery and genocide. And for what it's worth, you don't have our permission to do this. And then we've done a couple others. We did one in Wall Street as part of the World Freedom Day and the Federal Reserve. And so, yeah, I've gotten dandelions from Switzerland. I've gotten dandelions from all over the US. I've got, you know, people.
I'll be sure to send you some from Scotland. I'll
that would be really great.
Yeah, I will.
Anyway, but and that might seem corny, but at the same time, I don't think you fight it on their terms. And I think we have to fight it from a place of love. Like when I went to New York, what I left at the base of the Wall Street Bowl was a copy of the book, A Wrinkle in Time, which is a children's book, Madeleine L'Engle. And at the end, it's from the 70s. And they fight IT, this technocracy, this artificial brain.
What is it called again?
It's called A Wrinkle in Time.
A Wrinkle in Time. Well, I'm gonna rewatch the edited.
Don't look at the movie. It's terrible. Read the book.
I'm saying I'm not gonna forget. I was gonna write it down, but I realized I'm recording.
Yeah, you'll have it.
It's not,
but she overcomes the artificial brain with love because she's so angry and she's like hate and she's like, what do I have that it doesn't have? And what the IT didn't have was love. And so I think as we try to figure out how to navigate our way, and not that it's easy because sometimes I get really frustrated with people, but we have to keep coming back to a place of care, a place of open doors, a place of open hearts, because both for tactical reasons, the people who want to oppose this want to frame us in a certain way. And really, if we are fighting for natural life, when I was in Foley Square and standing in front of Lorenzo Pace's sculpture called The Triumph of the Human Spirit, it was a ship of the Middle Passage and this Chihuahua statue on the top, which was a symbol of cultivation and fertility. And I pointed to that and I said, that's what we're actually standing for, is natural life. So we have to do that from a place of care. We can't do that from a place of aggression.
Yeah, I completely agree. And as you said, not fighting on their terms, and love really, I don't even know what to say, but I completely I agree. It's if we just push back with anger and hate, sometimes I get angry. So when I learn about certain things, I really get frustrated. But ultimately we're here, and getting angry and fighting with these sort of bad negative energies is just gonna, first of all, as you said, from a strategic point of view, it's just gonna work against us, because we are seeing already people like us being framed as some sort of, disinformation. I've seen the word terrorist flying around. with people who refuse the sort of mainstream narratives of what's happening. You have the German CIA basically tracking people that talk about vaccine hesitancy and all of this basically. So we do have to come from a place of love and understanding, and that's the only way we're going to be able to push back to any significant degree. But yeah, and so I wanted to ask you also about, because I'm going to have a lot of friends who'll be listening from South Africa. That's where I lived for 5-6 years, and Swaziland, now Eswatini. So I just wanted to ask you about, because all these big projects, whether it's digital IDs, blockchain identity, they don't just get rolled out from one day to the next. They need places to test and optimize and all that. So of course, there's a lot of this is happening in Ethiopia, I'm quite sure, with Cardano, and that it's a very broad topic as well, and probably could spend hours talking about it. But and also South Africa, you had sent me something about blockchain babies in Cape Town, I believe. And is there anything else we can learn on this? Because we've already talked about quite a bit on this side of things, but about Africa specifically and why it's been used. Of course, you can make the sort of extension of the colonial project and how Africa has been for a while the testing ground for also not just this, but different vaccines and medicines and stuff. But do you have any interesting comments on this or?
Yeah, well, so when I was first understanding from the education space about blockchain identity, so I watched 4 hours. So New America has a program on had a program on blockchain. It was maybe from 2017 or 2018. It was New America and the World Bank on blockchain. It was 4 hours. And then about in the middle of it, there was this guy, his name is Sean Conway. And he was with IXO Foundation and this thing called Trust Lab. Now, IXO Foundation, I think, has since kind of folded, but they still have a presence online. I think you could probably find it in the Wayback Machine. And there's a video that essentially it's a 2.5-minute video about that overlays the world on data. Like if you wanted to understand the spatial web, is just look at this 2.5-minute video from IXO Foundation that says, the water system is overlaid with ones and zeros. The forest is overlaid with ones and zeros. The children, and no one is left behind, right? This is no one is left behind in this world. And I have to say, I've had several people over the course of this journey, tell me that they've had very sort of visionary experiences about being revealed to them a world covered in AI in this way, and them feeling that they have to say something, right, to intervene in this space. So that is, it's very, I've said, yep, I think it looks like this. I haven't seen your vision, but maybe it looks like what IXO Foundation is talking about. So Sean Conway was with an organization, again, IXO Foundation, and also in South Africa, I think it's Innovation Edge. It's either innovation or innovative. I think it's Innovation Edge. And it was backed by UNICEF and Omidyar and Trust Lab. And what they did was they set up a digital identity pilot on blockchain for pre-K, right? And again, they want the children. And this pre-K equation is tied to Jim Heckman at the University of Chicago, this pre-K investing scheme. It's global. And it's tied also through Ready Nation and Robert Duger, who's working with Paul Tudor Jones, who's a hedge fund manager in Connecticut. So they brought people to New York to talk about global early childhood investing, which is really getting these children on blockchain. And ultimately it's to feed them to the robots. But it all sounds good, right? We realize it's an economic hardship. Most families need 2 incomes, or more. And so affordable childcare is important. So they would have a government subsidy for, I'm trying to think if the company was called Apple, I'm trying to remember the franchise. It was a franchise pre-K. And so what they did was they said the government would reimburse how many children by how many days. And they used to do it on paperwork. And then, there's a bit of a sort of a racist element of they're probably fudging their numbers, right? Or whatever. So we're going to put it on blockchain. It'll be easy. You'll just have an app.
Of course.
So every child has a unique identifier. Every franchise of the pre-K has an identifier, every teacher, every administrator. And then that sets up the tracking system. And so every child comes in, they get that day at click, and it's very, very simple. And they actually framed it. So this program, this app is called Amply, AMPLY, and there's videos of it online that you can see. Early Bird, I think it was Early Bird Education, maybe. And they framed it specifically that children would build social capital. Like that the children from 3 years old would be building social
Like
capital.
explicitly, they framed it
It
that way.
specifically
Yeah.
said, yes, and that they would use the predictive analytics to create these robust profiles of children. So like, Jeff Bezos is now investing in Montessori pre-K, right?
God,
It's not
yeah.
because Jeff Bezos cares about homeless people or children. It's this Ekman equation. So the thing is, there's this other woman, Anne Connolly, I think, who's his other staffer, who was talking about last mile impact verification. So getting this impact data, and how they really wanted to automate it as much as possible, like to remove people as much as possible for the fidelity of the data, right? So eventually, like I'm sure they would love, they didn't say this, but like to have a biosensor in every kid. So when they walk through the door, there's like, a digital eye that would like click it instead of having the person click it. But until that happens, they're clicking it. So their other case study was an Internet of Things cook stove. So they would say, well, for sustainability reasons, we don't want people in Africa using wood to heat their homes or cook their food because of carbon and health or whatever, even though it's part of their culture. It's so dirty and dangerous. So
yeah.
Now we will give them a cook stove, but it's not a sufficient data just to give them a cook stove, because that's just one data point. We want to give them an Internet of Things enabled cook stove, so we know exactly when they turn it on and when they turn it off and how much they use. And that gives us the most impact robust data set to take our carbon offset, right? Yeah. And so in this, what this said to me, and this was 3 or 4 years ago, was they don't care if it's children or cook stoves. It's just stuff. Yeah. It's just numbers. It's just numbers to manage from a distance from Switzerland. And then it turns out IXO Foundation is working with something called IO2 Foundation, or Shanzai City in Hong Kong. And the guy, I think it's Tat Lam, is connected to Hong Kong, Columbia University, and University of London. Like, so again, global. They're blending Asia's sophistication with facial recognition and AI with the blockchain identity. So then they started using pilots where they would go into places in Brazil and China with like grandmothers and film their parenting on a tablet for this impact verification. And then it became automated. Like, and you could see like the squares over people's faces, and like you were supposed to read to the child. And then that was the impact data verification that would become automated. And how wonderful this all was as an impact opportunity. And this was backed by Pierre Omidyar, again, who's out of eBay. So auctions, right? And then also UNICEF. And UNICEF, they have an innovation fund that the largest funder is Disney. And they've essentially said they're doing a lot of pilots in India and Africa, that children in Nigeria there will never be money for schools for them or teachers. And so they're just going to boost them into the next generation by giving them virtual reality headsets, and they can use gestural coding to code. It's like a post-literacy. And actually it's this huge data harvest with the VR headset. So it's physically disconnecting either through VR or sometimes through ICT technology. So like there's this One Tab 1 billion project that's coming all through humanitarian aid. And also not even this One Tab is a small tablet, like a durable tablet, which is connected to like the Negroponte, one tablet, one laptop, one child out of MIT. So again, it's a war machine coming into Africa to like surveil the kids. And Bridges International is a huge part, but even down to a phone. So there was something called Curious Learning, which is connected, I think, with the 1billion.org or One Tab program that is embedded up in Oakland, California, and also MIT, again, war machine tech. And this image of Curious Learning on the homepage is like maybe a 3 or 4 year old little boy sitting on a hill of dirt in the middle of a field with an iPhone.
Yeah.
And they're like, this is how you learn outside of school. And so again, it is, I think, and this sort of speaks to what's happening with Ethiopia, with Cardano and digital identity, is that one, Africa and India are both like rich in material resources that are needed to run this virtual world, right? Like the rare minerals, the lithium, the cobalt, like
this green revolution isn't exactly gonna be
right, but we need it, right? We need it to track our sustainability. So, but then I think that there is also in both of these places, like if we understand it energetically, like a cultural grounding in natural systems, in the same way of like the indigenous connection in Turtle Island, but like that's being more and more removed, but that if they can capture that, if they can capture and disconnect people from the natural systems, disconnect people from their culture, frame it as disruptive innovation and aspirational to be like the West, right? To be cutting edge, to, the whole, Black Panther or Wakanda idea of like, you too can lead the techno revolution, not understanding that it's a Western militarized construct, that it's not your book, it's not your choose your adventure book, it was never our book, that will be a feat for them, to the material resources and then the spiritual energetic system of those continents of Africa and India. So Ampli and IXO are huge. I will say a lot of this is coming through humanitarian aid. The first blockchain baby was born in Tanzania. So that was again through humanitarian aid, and they would track all the prenatal care as a blockchain token. And it was linked to like MasterCard. So there will probably be a lot of the digital currency voucher systems are tied to dispossessed populations, refugee populations, Syrian refugees in particular, but other populations in Rwanda and places. They're given digital identities, and then they're given digital currency to spend attached to that identity. But it's conditional. It's all conditional, and they can turn it off when they want to turn it off. So Tanzania, Ampli, and then the other thing is in Ethiopia, Cardano, that Hoskinson, I think the guy's name is John O'Connor, is the Africa contact for Cardano there, which has an Edinburgh connection, because the digital identity system that they're imposing on 5 million students and teachers in Ethiopia, that Cardano is, it's being done through something called Inputs Outputs Hong Kong, IOHK. And the blockchain center for IOHK is actually in Edinburgh.
Okay. It's in Edinburgh.
So there's a connection there. And this idea that they will, boost these 5 million Ethiopian children into this digital age with the digital identity as investable human capital. The thing that many people may not be aware of with this Cardano pilot in Ethiopia is that it's in partnership with Ben Goertzel of Hanson Robotics and OpenCog. So he was the one that helped develop the Sophia the robot, humanoid robot that's the citizen of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
In Ethiopia, the AI of the brain of the robot was actually developed in a lab in, I think it's the Sheba Valley in Ethiopia, that it's like the Silicon Valley of Africa, and it's called ICOG Labs. It works with OpenCog Labs, and so they actually helped develop the brain
of this robot. Oh, okay.
Robot,
I did not
right?
know.
And so that they said after English, which was her first native language, they coded her to speak. Is it Amharic? Is the language of Ethiopia?
Yeah.
So because Ethiopia was so special. And so again, I have concerns, and I don't necessarily jump to the esoteric stuff, but like there's the whole like Gnosticism, mysticism, like it's not a coincidence that it's Sophia, the robot. Like there are these layers, right? And again, particularly they're trying to pull in girls in STEM. So Ethiopian women, like young women, to lead this revolution towards transhumanism.
Equality, of course. Yeah.
Right.
And that's always the excuse. Do you ever feel like you go crazy with all this information? Like, would you ever feel like, okay, I need to stop because if I absorb more, it's just going to be too much? Because it's honestly incredible that you can hold all these things, like, speak this way and hold them in your head at the same time. It gets so complicated. And I think that's also a big demotivator. Is that the word? Like sometimes you feel like there's so much, as I was talking about earlier, it feels like we're up against so much that you feel immobilized almost. But do you ever get that feeling, or do you just have this something that keeps pushing you ultimately to?
I mean, I was tired last night. I go to Arizona, which is the home of Michael Crow, right? And so I'm mapping. I mean, the hard thing is like part of my process is I do these maps, and they keep deleting stuff out of the maps.
Who keeps
which
deleting?
shows me that I'm on, my little sys maps. They deleted all the maps, but at least like I spent 3 days like with a friend, and we were putting in information for Dallas and biotech and the stuff, and they deleted it all. So it's like all memory holing. So it's like frustrating, but at the same time, it shows me that we're on the right track.
Yeah, it does.
And like, it's hard to walk away from it.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Like it's once you understand, and again, I don't necessarily, I'm not coming at this from a hopeless place. I think that's the thing that frustrates my family is they hear in the background that like, I talk about this stuff and they think I'm despondent. And I'm like, no, I don't actually. Like facing this or talking about it has led me to connect with amazing people all over the world, like to have these relationships. And again, like it's weird because again, it's on Zoom, but also my friend Neil Folman, who's a teacher, and we stand out on the median together and we say kids deserve better than Zoom school, and people are very generous. And so everyone's trying to figure out what can they do, right? How can they participate? Whether it's sending, today I got a couple days ago dandelions from Utah. And this person said they had picked them on the side of this river in Salt Lake City, which is a hotbed for all of this. And I was there in January, and they said they had taken them to a monument with a Shoshone chief who had been killed by the first settlers in that valley. And they were the community was acknowledging that harm, right? And trying to sort of figure out a path towards reconciling that past harm. And that someone would take this idea of these dandelions, right, and be so moved. And this is the waveform I'm talking about. If there's this locking in waveform, that there are these disruptions, right? And this disruption outside of Salt Lake with the dandelions and the intention that was carried to say, Alison, I heard what you were saying. There is harm. There has to be healing. We have to find some way. And the same with and it isn't hopeless because individually we all make choices, even if the choices may in and of themselves seem small.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine if a collective awakening happened, that we could coalesce around this and find the humanity. Like maybe this is this awakening. I'm not saying it from I'm not really new agey or hippie or whatever, but like I don't really see another way out. Yet I don't think it ends. I don't think it ends with the impact management project shoving all of our DNA into their simulation.
No,
I don't. I mean, I think the force of natural life is far too powerful for that.
Yeah, and there might be a lot of
what do we do? You know,
there might be a lot of
occupy ourselves in the meantime.
Yeah. And, there might be a lot of pain in the way, a lot of suffering. I don't know what it's going to look like, but ultimately, I really don't think that all these things are going to happen. They can't. It's not from a place of incredulity. It's more about the power of just human love and just, I don't even know what to say about this, but it's ultimately I think we will win.
And that's the other thing people have taught me about transmuting a little bit, and that's again like an energetic, as opposed to just revoking. Like I was revoking consent, and they're like, well, that just kind of creates a void, but you need to actually fill it with something,
channel it into something,
right? Yeah. And I have friends in India, and the model of the farmers' resistance to what's happening to the food systems, in India that they've
are you familiar with Vandana Shiva and her work?
I am. I mean, I think again, people with larger platforms are there for a reason. So I guess it would be interesting. If she ever speaks out about these things that I'm talking about, I would be very interested. As far as I can tell, she's in with the Greta crowd. But
okay,
I guess people can change.
Yeah.
With new information, people can adjust their analysis. I will not.
Add one very last super random question. So I started literally 15 minutes before our call. So my sister, she's 12 and she lives in Harare with my family in Zimbabwe. And she goes to international school there called the Harare International School. So I was just looking out of curiosity when I was preparing up one of the questions about education and just blockchain stuff. And I just went on the website of the school. Mm-hmm. And I look at, they always have the logos of the partners at the bottom. And whoever funds or who is involved, that they have the Association for Advancement for International Education, IB Continuum. But there was one that I just Googled quickly, and it's interesting. It's called MSA CES, MSACESS, and it's based in Philadelphia actually. And that's the only reason I wanted to ask you. It's the Middle States Association of Colleges and Schools.
Oh, interesting.
And I had literally, I Googled it. I mean, I researched it, as I said, 10 minutes before our chat. So I really did not have time to do further research, but I just saw this was one of the logos. And I just wonder if you had any knowledge of that, literally. That was my question. And it's interesting how this seemingly mostly American association is involved with
The
international school
international
in
programs.
Harare.
It's interesting because, yeah,
Yeah.
they do often the international schools um, make their way around for I mean, so I don't know if it's the same as the Middle States accreditation. When I was first doing my work in the education space, I was trying to stop or push back against the standardized testing, right?
Mhm.
The limiting of education to these standards that were harmful and that were being weaponized to close schools. And so there were groups like these Middle States accreditation that were pushing eventually what seemed to be like alternate options, which at the time, and this is why I keep being cautious about wanting to give people as much information as possible, because our movement was used to advance something we didn't intend, right? They used our movement to opt out of end of year tests to push ed tech that would data mine the children all the time, right? And we did not foresee that because we didn't have all of the picture of where the road went. We were simply reactive to the immediate situation. And so they would, it's like problem, reaction solution.
Reaction, yeah.
Like they give you the problem to drive you in the direction of what they want. So these Middle States people were involved in saying, yeah, you're right, the testing is rotten. But ultimately what's the direction things were going in would be, it's called mastery based education, proficiency, or competency, or often project-based learning, right? They're like, this is much better learning, right? You're not just sitting on a computer, you're learning, you're doing projects, and then you can just demonstrate you have a competency in it, right? But the trick is that this is going to be linked into augmented reality and blockchain learning lockers, and not really about projects. Like, I mean, I think of project and I think of like the paper mache penguin my kid did in second grade, and we studied penguins and then they made a penguin. No, like in this, it'll be that you're in some sort of STEM cyber lab space environment, and your hologram is sitting there with kids from the other international schools, right? And you guys are all sitting in there doing a project together on sustainability in your, haptic suits or something. And like, no one's going to tell you that like in advance that that's what the project is going to be. But like Stanford knows that, like they've already got the rubrics to do it. The people who are doing the AR simulations, who are saying it's much cheaper than even doing online learning to just make a simulation of it, they know that. The people who are pushing blockchain education and digital twinning, they all know that. They're not going to tell people until it's too late because it sounds good. So my sense is I will have to look into this a little closely, but if it's the same Middle States, then the question is, I just posted to my YouTube channel something called Class Wallet. Mm-hmm. So really what the next phase of education as they unbundle and disassemble education is they want people to hate public schools because they were always pretty oppressive, and they're becoming increasingly oppressive, and everything that was nice about them has been gutted out. Extracurriculars, sports, plays, choir, all libraries, all that's gone, at least in Philadelphia. And now it's just, you just go to get tested and consume content. It's just terrible. So they want to kill that idea. And then they want people to want choice, but the choice will come with a digital voucher, right? It will come with an electronic currency system that is tied to your blockchain identity. And then you can buy access to online evidence-based curriculum that will shape you to what this fourth industrial revolution citizen that they want. But the money is only going to be enough for low-income people to buy like 95% online curriculum and maybe go to a makerspace every once in a while and check in with your QR code. And that's how it's going to be geared. And so I was in Arizona, they have these education savings accounts or educational scholarship accounts that are geared towards children on Indian reservations, right? Children in schools graded as a D or an F, children of military families, and children with special needs. Okay. So children in these vulnerable categories get the account. It used to be a debit card, but now it's an online portal, and they track every single thing. And they're like, oh, look here, you can choose from these 40 retailers to buy from, but it's Amazon, it's Best Buy. Like, so it's not really a choice.
A choice. Yeah.
And so it's they want that, like you can buy your homeschool curriculum from Amazon, right? The other piece is there's something called low-cost private schools that is a whole huge model that is based on sort of knockoff high-end private schools. So I'm trying to remember Bill Gates's school in Seattle, Lake something. I'll have to look it up. I'm spaced on it, but like the head of school there came out of these international schools, like in Israel or Switzerland or whatever. and he's been there for 20 years. He's the head of the private school organization of the United North America. They have Lakeside, I think. They have like a knockoff version, right? They have a knockoff version that's mostly blended learning, that's project-based, that has a brand. So it's like a step down, like private school. And these are based in some ways on this Bridges International Academy in Africa and India, which are these subscription tablet, $1 a day. The teacher reads a scripted curriculum on off of a tablet to kids in a classroom. So there's all of these tiers of managing the educational process, but then they do need people in the elite schools to all be on the same page about running the data dashboards, right? And that's the thing. My child went to a magnet school here in the city. I mean, and they're at a privileged university at the moment. And I'm speaking out because in this world that I see, there's such a disparity. There's almost everyone who is oppressed, and there'll be a veneer layer of people who run the machine that does the oppression, and then there'll be some billionaires and robots. But who would aspire to want their child to be in the layer of those that oppress other people? Because that's a soul-killing enterprise. And so I would think even those of us who have privilege, who might think we can navigate it, would we ever want to allow a world to be built where our children, their only option was to be an oppressor? And I don't think that most of us would want that to happen.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that answer?
Well, it was a very open question because I wasn't ready for it, but yeah, it was definitely useful. But anyway, it's been, how long has it been? An hour and 45 minutes, more or less. I really enjoyed this discussion. And thank you so much again for coming on the podcast, even though I have a very small audience still and still growing. But I think, and it was very, very good and enlightening discussion in many ways. And
people just need the bigger picture so that they can make
exactly. And
I mean, I'm not here to tell people, especially people of Africa or people of Scotland, what to do about it. But if I'm sitting in a hub where a lot of this is going on, where I know that there's more to the story than is being told, people deserve to know as much information as I can have available.
Yeah, no, and I think you're really great at explaining the big picture. And my family will watch this also. And as I told you, I have a really young 12-year-old sister who's super worried about, she got her report card today and she was super happy. She's very, what do you call her? Smart, but the word escapes me. She's very education oriented. She's very good at school. She's very engaged with her education. So I think it's good for my mom and my dad to understand also a lot of what's happening. My dad is very on this side. He understands a lot, especially regards to the pandemic and how it's being used. My stepmom actually is starting to understand a bit, but I really do think that this will be very useful for them in terms of understanding, especially the education side and how children, literally they're coming for the children. And
they're feeding them to the robots.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the rabbit hole. Like, I'm like, I understood the finance. Like, I did not understand the transhumanism. Like, I didn't understand, artificial general intelligence and these robots and how it, the biometric data capture on your headsets. Like,
it's incredible.
And I don't want to talk about any of that. Like,
yeah. Eugenics got rebranded so easily, it seems.
It's precision medicine now.
It's all these nice buzz. Anyway, thank you so much. Where can people find most of your work and follow you on social media, or where would you direct them?
Sure. Well, I've been a bit lazy about writing lately, but I have a blog that goes back quite a bit. There's a lot of material called Wrench in the Gears, wrench like the tool, like throw a wrench in the gears. I have Great a YouTube channel that's just under my name, Alison McDowell YouTube. I think.
Oh, you still have a YouTube channel? Yeah, you do.
Well, I don't really talk about the stuff they don't want us to talk about. I'm not in the.
You're too ahead because everyone's talking about.
They're like, wait a minute, we're not supposed to talk about badges now. So yeah, and to me, that's the unifying. Like, I'm not trying to just talk about other stuff because this is what I've always been talking about. And this thing is the shift towards into the digital identity and the biometrics and the biosecurity state, but I haven't fundamentally changed my focus. Like, my focus is about smart systems of oppression against vulnerable populations. And and then I'm on Philly 852 is on Twitter. If people I've been posting more there. So
cool.
Look me up. If I would love to be proven incorrect.
So exactly. That would be great.
I always say that. I'm like, if you have an alternate analysis that is compelling, that is not simply Mark Zuckerberg is a great guy, or it probably won't happen. Like, if you have something more complex than that, I'd love to hear it.
Great. Thank you so much, Alison. And I'll
All
be
right.
looking forward to your next work. And I know you've been very active with the revocations of consent and the dandelions. And I will make I will promise I will send you some dandelions one way or another.
Oh,
I
on
will
my
do that.
blog, if you guys just put in dandelion in the search bar, it will come up. It has my address.
Cool. Perfect. Thank you so much. Have a great
All
rest of
right.
your day.
All right. You
Yeah.
too. All
Cheers.
right. Bye-bye.
See you.